Hello, friends. Time for another trauma talks. Let's talk about key concepts in complex trauma. So, as our previous videos go, we're focused on the complexity of what we would call complex trauma, complex post traumatic stress, and how common this actually is. Some of the previous videos will give you more information on about trauma and what leads to these type of woundings and whatnot. And today we'll talk a little bit more about the key concepts. So as I look here and look at the manual, one of the things that is really significant in complex trauma is the shame. There is this accumulation of shame for what we did or didn't do. So this is where some of this complexity comes in, because it's especially powerful in those relational traumas. And complex trauma often has many different situations where there were relational wounding. And so it's really significant in our relationships as we develop and grow and form our sense of self and just get through all the developmental stages that we need to, that we're able to work through situations. When we don't, shame accumulates. And shame is really a defense. It comes in as a defense. It's a protective, it's a survival mechanism. When we're having situations where the relationships around us are not consistent, or they don't feel safe enough, or there's just too much chaos, or any of these kind of situations. And you can refer back to some of the videos that talk about like these types of woundings and these types of situations. Or maybe the traumas were, just traumatic things happening, but there was no support around them, right? So maybe they were outside of a relationship, like a car accident or or something that happens, but there wasn't the support relationally for the child or the teenager or even the adult, right, to move through those things. Shame comes in. And it's interesting because earlier in my career as a therapist, I really kind of saw it as, well, shame must be kind of the deepest emotion or problem, right? And shame is corrosive. There's no question, but I see it more that it's more often now a way that we almost protect ourselves in this world. And so in a sense, it's more of a protection, a defense. Nonetheless, it feels awful, right? Like we don't want to feel shame. So then our whole systems start to develop in order to not feel that shame, to not relive and experience those shameful experiences. But the shame itself, when we have had attachment woundings or things that have been traumatic, or we've had lack of support through situations, then there has to be this sense of early on in our lives, in order to survive and attach, there's really not the cognitive ability, first of all, to really organize all the information and say, well, this isn't my fault, or this has nothing to do with me. So an adult capacity with full developmental ability and not having so much shame embedded in would be able to take a situation and depersonalize that situation and be like, oh, this really isn't me in this traumatic situation. Like, it's not my fault that this happened, and resolve it and move through it. So for children and teenagers, they need someone else to be able to help them do that. That's how they learn to regulate. And when that's missing, and traumatic events, or even relational difficulties happen over and over and over, and then that piece is missing, then the internalization has to be, well, there's something wrong with me. I'm broken. I'm a problem. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. These are all shame So if you use like Brene Brown's work, which is terrific, by the way, and all of her research on shame, you know, you look at what is shame. Shame is something of like a sense of, I am not worthy. I am not good enough. These statements that I'm using, right? And so notice like how deep that is. Like, I'm bad. I am a bad person, or it's my fault. I created this. I'm not good enough, right? Guilt, on the other hand, is what I did was wrong, or that behavior of, of mine or someone else's was quote unquote bad, right? But there's a difference. So notice the difference if I said I don't like my behavior. I feel guilty that I engaged in that behavior, or I said that, or I did that, versus I feel ashamed that I'm that horrible of a person. So the depth of that is much more significant. I'm a horrible person versus that was a horrible thing I did. That was horrible of me, but that doesn't mean I'm a horrible person. So you can see that differentiation, right? So in complex trauma, there was no differentiation of this. This became the protection. And if I keep telling myself, so parts of us will learn from these internalizations young through these relational traumas. Well, if I keep if I keep beating myself up first, then someone else can't do it. It won't hurt as bad when the relationships around me do it, right? If I take on that I'm unworthy, or I'm a bad person, or a bad kid, or I'm bad, or whatever it is, I'm broken, there's something really wrong with me, then it becomes a locus of control. We all of a sudden have some control. Is, well, I'm going to then internalize that, believe that, and do it to myself before other people can do it, because that's so hurtful and it's so painful. And so you can see how it embeds and becomes a protection. And so this is often in therapy, in good therapy, you're working through those things so that you can start to build in that differentiation that I was talking about, and move through some of these experiences. Because as an adult, or maybe now you're a teenager, whatever it is, you can learn to start to differentiate those things. You can, not that it's easy, but it was coupled in. It's like it literally, in our neurobiology got wired in. And so we have to kind of loosen that up so that we can unwire that internalization, because it's safe enough to do that now. This is really challenging when people are still in traumatic situations, because there isn't a reality of I am safe enough to do that now. So this becomes very challenging. And so the work becomes, if you are still in a threatening situation or abusive situation, whether you're an adult or child or a teenager, the work really is, how do you protect yourself? How do you move yourself out of those threatening situations if you can? If you can't, then how do you tolerate and build? But once you're out of them, or at least enough out that you could be safe enough, because the world obviously has things. And so there's the reality of that, but you don't need it for survival anymore. You don't need to have that be so strong. Then you can uncouple that and start to work through that. It is powerful work, and it's not easy work. And it is powerful, and it is possible. So as I look at this too, making sure that I get all my points here, because there's some really good information in here. Really, like we said, shame becomes corrosive. It's strengthening core internalizations of being broken, bad, unlovable, or unworthy. During the trauma, the wounding, instinctual defenses come up. So these are mammalian, right? They're not just human. But, if any of you know my little catchphrase, we're all human. Let's love and support and, grow together or whatnot. But it's really mammalian too. It's not even just human. So our dog will have very similar things wired in. So when we have these traumatic experiences, we are built, we're wired to have certain defenses that come up to help us survive, and that's evolutionary, and it's there. It's just going to be there. So that gets wired in. So they are involuntary, right? So if we're going through a trauma, this is not voluntary. We don't actually, our prefrontal cortex here is not engaged when it's actually our back brain and this reptilian brain back here that is in the moment of a traumatic situation that is on. And so this becomes dormant during that. That's mammalian. That's not me or you, right? It's actually mammalian that's going to happen. Well, this would be the part that's going to make some logical sense of itself. So this is dormant. This comes on. And so these defenses get activated again to save our life, like to protect us. And so the important piece that I really want to stress here is that it's involuntary. But what happens after traumas is that we start to try to resolve and make sense of the traumas. And again, if we don't have the support, especially when we're younger, these things are left unresolved and they accumulate and they cause these problems. And so these internalizations become very core. But what becomes also with this shame that's really important is, like I said, it's involuntary. But we try, as we're trying to make sense of it, it's like, why didn't I say no? Why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I run away? Why didn't I do these things? And it's like these defenses of running away, of freezing, of shutting down our dorsal vagal ventral system, which is part of our nervous system, fighting, whatever these reactions are. And in a lot of traumas and relational traumas, sometimes it is this shutdown, like we freeze and we can't act in a way that maybe we would have wanted to later. But then we try to make sense of that, and we say, well, or I did fight. Why did I fight? Right. So it might be the opposite. It might be, why did I do that? Or why did I run away? And then shame starts to come in. Like, why didn't I do that? Something's wrong with me. I'm weak. I'm broken. I'm not able to do what I need to do. And then we become teenagers, adults, and we're no longer be able to do that. So a situation happens to us, and the same thing happens with these instinctual defenses that have been now wired in, especially in complex trauma, because it's happened so many times, is it comes up again. And so then what do? We internalize even more of the shame. It's this vicious cycle of like, I didn't react. I didn't do what I should have done, or I did react and I shouldn't have reacted. I'm raging. I'm in this fight response. I feel so ashamed of it. I'm this and that. So any of these responses, I run away and I can't deal with this situation, whatever it is that defense gets frozen and then it comes up involuntarily for us in situations, and it just keeps the cycle going, and the shame keeps the cycle going. Often underneath that shame can be grief, despair, loss, and then of course there can be frightened, wounded parts of us, that are really hard and overwhelming for us to actually deal with and resolve, especially when it's happened over and over. So you can see too why this kind of locks into place for people. It's more protective, and even though it sucks and it's hard, in a way it's easier than that, right? Or it's easier than remembering those things, or it's easier than taking in the realization that, my parent or whoever didn't care enough about me, right? Like that's even worse, right? So it's like, okay, I'm going to just, and not consciously, but unconsciously keep this cycle going. But inevitably, then it doesn't heal, and it creates us so many more problems in our adulthood. So really being able to be with those deeper, what we call exiled emotions of that despair and that frightened and that And that sense of like not having that grief of not having what we needed is so healing and transformative. I just have to even breathe with that, right? But it's also can be overwhelming. And this is why in complex trauma, it's important to have support systems and to do this in a titrated way, like not in an overwhelming way, but in a gentle way to rework that nervous system and to shift those patterns. Just to kind of sink that in a little bit more too, is again, we said these involuntary physiological responses, they could become internalized when there's no resolutions afterwards. Like there wasn't the soothing, the support to really heal these wounds. The first time this happens, the brain begins to wire in the internal experience. And it develops patterns of our emotional effect, somatic expressions, somatic experiences, right? Like heart racing, tension in the body, things going on. Oh, I got the dogs going by that. They were just gently sleeping there. And then that pattern happens again and again, and it freezes in. So it's the pattern just freezes in, it gets wired in. And essentially, this is an important point, the person ends up reliving the wounding over and over. Right? That's kind of what complex trauma ends up happening later. And so this is where it's so crucial to get in and help the break, and move through these patterns in ways that can feel resolved and that we can regulate and move through these patterns. And it just heightens those symptoms. And again, you can go back to my earlier videos to really get the symptoms. Like, what are those symptoms of complex trauma? And are you experiencing them? Are someone you love experiencing them or care about? Or if you're a therapist or a healer is your clients or your patients or other people, and how do we work with that? So I hope this is helpful. That's a lot for today, to just let that sink in and really start to understand. And we'll just I'll keep sending out some videos to keep learning like what it is, how do we work with it, and just keep building on this. Thank you, friends. Namaste.